All right, so before we move off of Teddy Roosevelt, I do want to mention in 1902, Teddy Roosevelt was a voracious reader. So, he's often kind of seen as the man's president, but he's also pretty intellectual as well. He had put off that man's kind of because he was very sickly as a child. Probably didn't help that his mother used to put him in dresses too. Uh, Probably not great for the psyche. I don't know. Of course, everybody did back then, apparently. Anyway, in 1902, one day he's eating breakfast and he's reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And I don't know if you've read The Jungle, but basically, Upton Sinclair is a socialist who's trying to point out why capitalism is bad by pointing out all the problems that were in meatpacking plants. So, very gruesome. There's a movie they put out a few years ago called Fast Food Nation, actually starring Avril Lavigne of all people. That kind of explores this kind of thing. Anyway, it talked about how people are losing limbs and their fingers are going into hamburger and whatnot. And Roosevelt's reading this while he's eating breakfast, and he throws down his sausage. He says, "I have been poisoned." And what that'll lead to is the Pure Food and Drug Act and the beginnings of inspections of USDA inspections of meat and other factories like that. Something that this current administration actually had at one point been talking about trying to end. But it's kind of interesting what meatpacking plants are still allowed to get away with. Pink ooze in your hamburger, or Chicken McNuggets have anti-foaming agent. I don't really know why. But that's one of the kind of important things I think that comes out of the progressive era is food safety as well. So Roosevelt serves his 2 terms, more or less. 1908, he decides not to run for re-election, and he throws his support behind William Howard Taft. Taft wins the presidency. He saw the presidency as the executor of laws and the supporter of existing institutions. And basically, he has a judge's mindset. It's very black and white. He would not distinguish between good and bad trusts. He said basically the law says that trusts are illegal, therefore all trusts are bad. And so he actually brought action against U.S. Steel, Andrew Carnegie's company, which Roosevelt had always seen as in the interest of national security and as a good trust. So basically, Taft serves his term. In 1912, Roosevelt is very upset about what Taft has done. He feels like he had not lived up to those progressive values. So Roosevelt actually runs against Taft in what is kind of the Republican primary, though it's the big wigs in the party that selected the nominee back then. Well, because the party elites were more corporatist, Taft won the Republican nomination. So Teddy Roosevelt forms a third party, the Progressive Party, known as the Bull Moose, because when a reporter asked him how he felt, Teddy Roosevelt responded, "I am as fit as a bull moose." Don't really know what that means exactly. The Democrats, thinking, wow, we got a good shot here, nominate T. Woodrow Wilson. T stands for Thomas, who was the governor of New Jersey and had been president of Princeton, who, is also a progressive, but has kind of some racist issues. So you got an election in America. That's the only time you're actually going to have 3 progressives running at the same time. So basically, Roosevelt pushed for a plan he called New Nationalism. You put new in front of something, it's so good. And what he wanted was increased federal regulations and widespread political reforms. He wanted to regulate but not destroy big business. Wilson called his plan New Freedom, where small businesses and farmers would be given a hand. So what the difference between Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson is Roosevelt's going for a top-down approach, while Wilson is trying for a bottoms up approach. Now, what about Taft? What is his big slogan? What is he pushing? Well, basically, we can call that no new nothing. He's like, whatever the laws are, that's what I'll support. It's not my job to push for ideas. Now, it's probably not surprising that William Howard Taft will go on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because this is really his mindset. So, there is also a fourth man running. Eugene Debs runs as a socialist. He's in jail for most of it. Wilson will win in an electoral college landslide. He came into office. He cut tariffs. He instituted the first federal income tax on those making over $4,000 a year, which frankly wasn't that many people. Definitely a tax on the rich. He also will try to improve the flow of credit. Back in 1907, we had the Panic of 1907, where actually J.P. Morgan, you remember Roosevelt destroyed his trust, actually used his own money to prop up the banking system. So, we could have had a depression if not for J.P. Morgan. Well, the problem with the banking system at the time is there are 7,000 banks that were independent, and they were issuing all kinds of currency. Some were backed by gold, silver, government bonds. Some places they were even backed by tobacco or other commodities. Congress will pass the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. It would be the Bankers' Bank, which would hold a portion in reserve for times of crisis. The Federal Reserve is somewhat controversial in libertarian circles, especially. You got Ron and Rand Paul running around to audit the Fed, where, it actually does get audited, just not by Congress. I don't want to get started on Rand Paul. I don't care for him. So what the Federal Reserve also does, and we see this, during our financial calamities, is they set rates for business loans and they issue paper currency. So, that's kind of where our modern currency and modern system begins, is with the Federal Reserve Act. In 1914, Congress passes the Clayton Antitrust Act, which said that you cannot set up shadow companies that appear to compete. It also exempted trade unions from prosecution. And the Justice Department could order businesses to stop unfair trade practices. So we had talked about holding companies before, where, that was kind of the last way around trust, is like you held different companies. Well, it didn't outlaw holding companies. You're actually allowed to own. You can have a holding company, and it can own different types of businesses, but it's not supposed to own any two businesses that are in the same field. If you do, then you have to get a special dispensation to run that. For instance, the last one I remember, and you remember that was actually the kerfuffle over AT&T buying DirecTV that the Trump administration tried to stop. Well, it also happened with, Viacom, when they merged with CBS the first time. That meant that CBS now owned the CBS network and UPN, technically two competing over-the-air networks. Well, government was like, that's just UPN, who cares? So, there obviously have been some exceptions. Of course, baseball has an antitrust exemption too. So another part of the progressive era is having to decide what to do with natural resources. We can go back to 1890 for our first national park, Yosemite. We have the creation of the Sierra Club in 1892, who wanted to preserve the wilderness. Roosevelt, during his time, will create 5 national parks and 18 national monuments. He wanted to regulate but not ban public access to federally controlled lands, which will lead to some logging of federal lands. In 1900, the U.S. was one of the most strike-torn countries in the world. Progressives wanted to change this. Some industrialists tried to give their workers some benefits, mainly so that they would not join a union. We kind of saw that with Pullman's Company Town. Um, and, in some cases, they would offer a pension after 20 years, but they kind of made it where it's going to be very difficult to get to 20 years because if you got seasonally laid off, you had to start all over again. And you had a lot of people fired before they could get their paid vacations or other things. Um, Others wanted unions to negotiate permanent benefits because, while a industrialist might be pretty generous when things are good, they might try to, mess you over when things are bad, like we saw with Pullman. Um, so during this time, we also had Henry Ford with his assembly line. Created cheaper cars. He wanted to make a car that his employees could actually buy. But he paid his workers well, but he also interfered in their lives. He had scientific management to limit workers' freedoms and make factories more efficient. He also hired private investigators and psychologists to make sure that they had the right kind of people working there. Of course, Henry Ford is a little problematic anyway. He'll be a Nazi sympathizer. Another thing that's going to happen, the Ludlow Massacre on April 20th, 1914. The governor of Colorado sent in troops to stop the strike. They set fire to the miners' camp, killing 13 women and children who suffocated. Wilson actually sent in the federal troops not to help the Union, but to break the Union. So many began to believe that unions were necessary because the government could not always be counted on to help out. So next, I want to talk about women and children in the workforce. In 1908, Kurt Mueller of Oregon challenged a 10-hour work act that said women could only work for 10 hours a day in Oregon. He said that it deprived women of the right to control their own labor. That's right, they're making a pro-choice argument here. Well, the problem was, he said scrubbing in hot temperatures all day were not harmful to the health of women. So in 1908, Mueller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court upheld the maximum hour laws and cited reproductive health as a reason to limit the amount of work that women should be allowed to do. So that's kind of insulting, really. Some saw this as a victory, others saw it as, well, a problematic ruling. Well, after that, basically what Mueller did is he fired all the women and he hired Chinese immigrants. So that one didn't really work out too well. The AFL liked the ruling because it meant that there was more, it lessened the incentive to hire women over men. In 1898, working class and middle class women formed the National Consumers League. They began to coordinate boycotts of department stores that mistreated female clerks. Eventually, they boycotted stores that used sweatshops and child labor. The way that the owners fought this is they got laws passed that said that it was illegal to compile a blacklist of stores to compete. So what the organizers then did is they put out white lists, which were stores who had good labor policies. So in a way, that's actually better because you know for sure that the company you're going to is doing what they're supposed to. Women were also concerned about vice. They believed that drunkenness was becoming a major problem. And so we had a lot of temperance organizations. On June 6, 1900, 64-year-old Carrie A. Nation went into a Kansas bar with a bag of bricks and smashed up all the liquors. Let me show you a picture of Carrie A. Nation. How would you like to meet her in a dark alley? That hatchet becomes her symbol. They actually sell hatchet pins to fund the organization, pay for bail, that kind of thing. Drinking had been on the rise in this country from 1885 to 1900. Beer consumption doubled from 570 million gallons a year to 1.2 billion. This led to the home defender movement led by Carrie A. Nation, where others actually began to go into the local bars and smash it up. Working class men defended their right to drink, but this began a movement to get rid of liquor. They said that politicians often bribed voters with liquor and were able to get some counties and entire states to go dry by 1917. By 1917, the number of dry states will move from 3 to 23. Tennessee will actually be, and I don't know how well you can see this, but that just kind of shows the two different maps of prohibition. Tennessee will actually go dry. If you've seen the movie Sergeant York, what they used to do is they used to basically party at the state line, and you just walk across the Kentucky state line and buy your liquor. Obviously, Kentucky's not going to go dry at that point because, well, we have bourbon here. But we do actually have some counties that did go dry. There's always an irony when I was growing up. Bourbon County was dry, but Christian County was wet. Go figure. This is also one thing that the middle class also wanted to do was they wanted to restore childhood. They wanted it to be more idyllic and full of play. And they thought that children's childhood should be about education and play. Now, the working class wanted their children to work because they needed the money. 1.7 million children worked in factories full time from the age of 10 to 15. Progressives thought that child labor should show the greed of the employees. Remember, children got paid 1/6 to half of what a man made. The working class argued that working built character for children. The working class was more interested in making factories safer. In fact, in immigrant families, children had an easier time getting work because they tended to learn the language easier. 25% of southern textile factories had children. In 1916, Wilson will sign a law forbidding interstate sale of products where it was made in a factory where it employed children. This only affected 150,000 child laborers out of the 1.7 million. And 2 years later, the Supreme Court shot it down anyway. A national ban on child labor won't occur until the 1930s, and that was really to get them out of the workforce. Mandated school attendance is what will actually cut down child labor. It's hard to be in two places at once. To help working class children, we began to set up urban playgrounds. You should actually check out some of the videos of those monstrosities. Basically, the idea was for children to have a safe place to play while they waited for their parents to get off work. We have a different view of that now. A few years ago, a couple actually got cited because they allowed their kid to go play at a playground that was a block away, that was in plain sight of the porch the entire time. They actually got in trouble for that. So, obviously we have a different view on that now. Of course, I understand protective parents. My mom, one thing I loved to do as a child, we went to the drive-in. Well, all these people getting out of the car and sitting there. My mom would never let us out of the car because she was afraid we'd get snatched up. So, let's talk about a couple more things and we'll call an end to the lecture. Let's talk about 1896 Supreme Court ruling Plessy versus Ferguson. Southern states began to pass laws that ensured segregation. Black leaders did not think that that was the appropriate thing to do. But what the Supreme Court ruled was separate was fine as long as it was equal. A terrible, terrible ruling because separate can never be equal, and they never even really tried. White schools tended to get more money. I want to talk about Booker T. Washington, someone I find to be really fascinating. He was born in 1859, so he was born to slavery. He promoted self help as a way to end poverty. In 1881, after he went to college at one of the HBCUs, he comes back to Alabama and creates the Tuskegee Institute, not to be confused with the Tuskegee Airmen or the Tuskegee experiments where we gave African Americans syphilis to see what would happen. He believed in economic advancement first, politics and civil rights later. Though he did privately support the goals of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP of more equality. But really, in a lot of cases, Booker T. Washington kind of gets a bad rap because he didn't forcibly fight for integration. Well, I think what we need to remember is he's in Alabama. That is the deep, deep, dark South. And, he was probably always towing that line. If he stepped out of line too far, the Tuskegee Institute would probably be burned to the ground. So, actually, I'd rather admire him. I got to do research on him a few years ago for a class. So I very much admire him. I understand W.E.B. Du Bois' point. In fact, Booker T. Washington sent his daughters to the North for schooling. Well, that's the progressive era. Keep an eye out for the test. It'll be a take-home test, so essay questions, and I'll have more information about that when the time is right. Thank you all, and I'll see you next time.